Hello friends, Libor Ondras here, music director of Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra. I'm joined by David Lockington, a close friend, fantastic musician, music director of Pasadena and Modesto Symphony Orchestras, music director emeritus of Grand Rapids Symphony Orchestra, fantastic cellist, collaborator, pedagogue, but mostly composer now, because we're going to talk about a piece that he has composed as a commission for Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra. We're going to introduce Violet Viola Concerto. Just to give you a quick background, David, his very talented wife Dilana Jensen, and I have presented a concert back in January of 2018 as a part of the Sunday music series. We called it the La Di Da Trio. And as a part of the repertoire we performed a couple of pieces written by David. I think it was the duet for cello that you have arranged for cello and viola, and a string trio piece dedicated to Dilana. Anyways, as an outcome, Dr. Pattingale approached David and asked him if he would consider writing a piece for Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra. And then I only found out later that David is considering writing a viola concerto, which makes me, honored for one, and excited. The concerto is titled Violet Concerto, and it's because of the second movement, which is a slow lullaby, peaceful, pastoral lullaby that, as I understand, you woke up one day in the morning and wrote down, and later dedicated to his firstborn granddaughter, Violet. So I'm going to start asking questions. David, where do you take your inspiration for your themes in the concerto?
Well, I started writing the concerto for you, which was an honor for me, before our granddaughter was born. And at that time, I was in a fairly deep emotional, not crisis, but what was coming out musically was very romantic and had quite a lot of tension in it. And my melodies often revolve around certain sort of harmonic chords, but then diverge into atonal kind of language. And what I love about melodies is a development within the melody that is continuous, so that a certain part of the theme will be repeated again later on in the melody. But the affect that I wanted to create was one of great, a kind of passionate sound that you don't always hear from the viola. And I was also thinking of you as a very passionate Slovakian violist and feeling that this was going to be a great vehicle for you. So I gained some inspiration also from sort of Eastern European, quasi-Eastern European themes and harmonic language from sort of the middle of the last century.
Well, it's noticeable when listening, but it's amazing when you go over the score and you look at the material in the score and trace those melodies and that thematic development as it passes from the viola to instruments of the orchestra. I find that you keep bringing them back in some shape or form, making the movement cyclical. Is that something of an intention? Are you looking forward to the formal organization of the piece? Or are you guided by thematic development rather than formal design?
Well, when I started the piece, as I mentioned, the first movement is quite serious. The second movement became, the melody became this violet lullaby. And that is a set of variations. When it came to the last movement, I wanted to make it dancing, and I knew as a part of the overall structure, I wanted it to have a climax that did, as it were, sew up some loose ends of thematic material from the first and the second movements. So there are parts of the first movement that come back and mingle and kind of playfully dance with the Violet theme, which is speeded up. And then at the very biggest moment in the last movement, the opening theme from the first movement returns. So, this idea of an apotheosis that leads to a sense of resolution is what I thought of as a structural arc for the whole piece. Then, of course, you start with a theme and then you think of development. It's very easy to write a melody. I'm sure many people have done exactly that. But to develop it has been a sort of a lifelong challenge for me. And I've normally written pieces that are only about 6 to 8, 10 minutes long. But in this piece, I really felt the need to create something that was going to make sense on an unconscious level for people that don't even know very much about music. There hopefully is a sense of satisfaction about the musical language and about the thematic development and recapitulation of those themes.
You mentioned dance-like character of the third movement, and I recall that there are rhythmic elements that represent various music cultures. So I've noticed there is the Scottish snap there. I've noticed, of course, the Hungarian Csardas movement. And I also noticed that there are lots of asymmetrical accents and asymmetrical rhythmic organization, hemiolas. I don't know, implying perhaps some of that American idiom. Were you conscious of those things? Are you blending those things, or is it just my imagination?
Well, the Scotch snap actually comes from a rhythmic motif in the first movement, so ta-da, which is also very European, Eastern European. And then at the time, you were off in Scotland. So the Violet theme speeded up with a Scottish, in a Scottish reel kind of dance-like form. It's a sort of an inside joke, but it seemed to grow organically. And so that's the underlying idea behind everything that I try to do, that it's an organic thing. One of the things that you mentioned when you looked through the last movement was that it had a kind of Baroque, almost ritornello form, where things come back and then go on to a new section, come back again. So it's like a precursor of the rondo form. And you got it absolutely right. But within that, there's constant playing with disjunct entrances, asymmetrical rhythms and phrase lengths, which is something that even in a Baroque piece or a classical piece, it's replete with phrases that are interrupted and phrases that are not 4 measures or 2 measures. They're 5 measures and 3 measures. They sound very logical. And this is something you mentioned, American style. Aaron Copland has done this all through his popular repertoire from the middle of the last century. But he makes it sound very natural. Even when you can't tap your toe in a perfect rhythm all the time, it feels that the melody is unfolding in an easy, natural way. And I tried to convey some of that quality too. I've always loved Copland, and even though the styles are quite different in a way from the beginning of the concerto to the end of the concerto, I like to think that it's a sort of a compilation of a lot of different elements that I've gathered together through my life and through my experiences.
It's fantastic. You mentioned ritornello-like, Baroque-like. I noticed that there is a lot of polyphony that you use, that textural contrast. Again, is it something that you organically came to? Is it something that you really wanted to distinguish those parts where you use polyphony from homophonic areas to create some sort of plan for the piece?
Just like any work of art, it's multi-layered. And there are techniques that you can use to create a sense of flow, a sense of stasis, and a sense of emotional density, polyphony, where you have lines on top of each other, which may or may not be related. This is where you can create a sense of tension and a sense of struggle almost. So I was very conscious of where I wanted the texture to be dense and where I wanted it to be very simple. In the lullaby movement, the second movement dedicated to my granddaughter, Violet, it was very much a question of melody and harmony most of the time. But when we get into variations, you'll often add a layer, and then pull it back. And in fact, in this movement, I took great pains to try to incorporate silence in there as well, so that there is a sense of release. And in fact, at the end of the movement, I imagine that Violet is falling asleep in my arms as I'm singing this lullaby to her. So this interplay between density, between melody and harmony and silence is something that has to be managed very carefully. And you also mentioned the accompaniment oftentimes reflects the melody. I've always enjoyed it when accompaniments have a supportive and reflective role. You don't necessarily hear them as related, but suddenly something pops out from the orchestra and it feels like a natural conversation between the solo instrument and between the orchestra. And with very small forces, I thought it was important for all of the instruments to be able to have their say at different times. It's scored for a small string section, single winds, that's flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, and just one horn and harp. And so there's plenty for everybody to do. And the harp, of course, adds a romantic texture at times, sometimes slightly percussive. And then the strings are required to do all sorts of things. A pizzicato, snapping the string as you lift it and drop it against the fingerboard. And also col legno, where you tap the string with the wood of the bow, turning it upside down. And so I wanted to create a pretty broad sonic palette with very small forces of the orchestra. And one of the things that I coach composers on, if they come to me, is I ask them, do you want this piece to be performed again? If you write for an orchestra that's enormous, especially today with this virus, and who knows how it's going to pan out for the future of orchestras, but if you write for too large an orchestra, it's not going to get played again. So I wanted to write something that was practical, that was playable, and I wanted to also make sure that the viola was absolutely in relief, that there's no question that the violist is the hero of this story. And you pull that off beautifully.
Well, thank you. And I have to say that it is very challenging to write for an instrument that covers pretty much the middle range of the string ensemble. And so to be able to hear the viola clearly, you have to be a master of orchestrator to keep that balance alive without really downplaying the orchestral's role. One of the things that I noticed, and this is not a complaint, I'm just saying there was a lot of material that was really in a really high position on viola. Again, was that your intent to keep the viola above the texture of the orchestra, or was there something else behind that? I know you are a fantastic cellist, and I know you're familiar and with all the string instruments, and can write idiomatically for string instruments. What of that knowledge have played a role and influenced the way and the range that you used for the viola, for the concerto?
Well, I wanted to convey the beauty of the tone from top to bottom of the viola, and I also wanted everybody to know that the viola is now, from the, let's say, the last 40 years, as virtuosic an instrument as any other instrument in the orchestra or beyond. And so, while it is very difficult, I had to consider how the viola sounds in these different registers. The top of the viola register isn't like the violin or the cello when it's playing up very high, where they can project very loud. It's a little bit more like the top of the bassoon register, which has got a slightly more muted quality, even though there's a sense of strain in the sound. And so when you are playing with the orchestra and playing up high, I've tried to make the orchestra still accompany and not overwhelm you. There are some times I wanted you to be just inside the sound of the orchestra, and that's what composers have always done. There have been times that it's just like a tutti that you join in. I particularly love the middle register of the viola, and so I wanted to, particularly in the second movement, I wanted to get some of the richness and that soulful quality of the D and G strings, high on the G string. I wanted for you to be able to develop the tone there and sort of sail through that middle section. Sometimes being accompanied by instruments in the same register and intertwining your melodies, and sometimes just free and open, almost a cadenza-like thing in motion in places. But then, of course, there's the C string on the viola. And the C string on the cello and the viola is a powerhouse. It's so exciting when you can dig into the C string and sing and be rich. And so I wanted to develop that too. So again, it's like any artist wants to convey the fullness of life in their work of art. And so I wanted to convey the breadth and the depth of what a viola could do, and also, how I feel and how I know you can play and master what I've given you.
Well, it's been a thrill ride for me to be able to do so. I know you've been on the other side of the aisle also. You have premiered pieces that were written for you by your friends, composers. Any thoughts for people down the road that will face that challenge of premiering, of giving birth to new works? You've been on both sides of the aisle. What are some of the suggestions, challenges, or ideas that you could pass on to the next performer, next composer?
Well, clearly you have to master the notes, and you have to get inside the emotion. You have to understand what the composer was intending when they wrote the music, but you also have to make it your own. And my experience with composers has been, for the most part, that they want you to take the bull by the horns and convey the fullest emotion that you can of the piece. I've very rarely heard somebody say, no, don't do so much. Most composers like the emotion to flow freely. And so it's a collaboration. I think as we were working together, you came with your ideas, I came with my ideas, and in the end, we're both compromising on stage. I'm listening to you as you're performing, and you're reacting to what's going on in the accompaniment. Now, strangely, we didn't have, it's my fault, a piano score of the orchestra. So in some ways, your ability to get deeply inside the piece was compromised because you couldn't hear the accompaniment. And I was so impressed how you owned it with so few rehearsals and so little time together with the whole orchestra. And you made this piece sound the way I felt it. And, I take my hat off to you. It's just a wonderful thing you did.
Oh, thank you so much. I am really, really honored to be part of it. And I'm looking forward to repeat this piece with you. And I'm also hoping that this piece will take a deep root in, performing arts and in the viola literature community, and become part of the, standard literature for future. Have you had the opportunity and experience of establishing a piece of music that was either written for you or you have given a first premiere or first performance, and then inaugurated the piece into that next phase?
Well, like you, I try to do as much music by living composers as possible. And I have these two wonderful friends that I've premiered works of, and my friend Philip Sawyers in England, his career has taken off in England as a result of commissions and performances we did here with the Grand Rapids Symphony. I'm very, very grateful for those opportunities, and I'm thrilled that it made a difference to his musical life. My other friend, Adolphus Hailstork, is a similar story where we recorded his second and third symphonies with the Grand Rapids Symphony, and those are now reference recordings for his works. So it's a great honor to be a part of that. I feel that we're creating pieces that are for the future. There will be pieces written during this coronavirus that will represent this time. That's what the arts are for. It's for the arts to speak of our times is the function of the arts. It's a different hat for every generation. We all look different, we dress differently. The music has got a different kind of language, but it's always the language of the soul and the experience of being human. So that's what I hope we can bring as we're both trying to present new music.
Thank you. Hats off to you for doing all you do for performing arts and musicians like myself and others. What are some of the near future projects that you're looking forward to?
Well, of course, the first thing is to crack the nut of how we're going to be able to perform live music in the future. You know, society will open up. There's a very good chance we'll have closures and openings for a period. And I'm sure there'll be a COVID-20 coming along at some point. So we've got to figure out how we can present music safely on stage and how audiences can engage with this miracle of live emotional transfer through music in a safe way. So that's the first challenge. Because there may not be as many performances in the same kinds of configurations, I suspect that we're going to be playing with smaller groups for a little while, which puts you at a great advantage.
That's right.
And also, we may be playing repertoire that people are very familiar with. But I also think that there's an opening for this very thing we've been talking about, the music of our times saying something about what we've all experienced. So I don't know what it's going to look like. I think we've already got parallel mediums that are doing great things. Music on the internet, recorded music, video performances. This is all very much the world we live in now. But I want us all to remember that the inception of this love of music comes from the airwaves being moved between us and that sense of community as we share something pretty miraculous in a concert hall. So,
David, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, and I hope they will enjoy Violet Concerto for now from the airwaves of internet.
yes.
But hopefully soon we'll be able to make those waves move between us and the audiences. Thank you so much, David.